Ready.
All right. All right. You know what? I'm going to record this too, to the cloud just in case the live stream goes wonky. Um, and we're live. Whoa. Welcome to this first conversation in a series of 4 on vetting or curating congregational song. I'll give you a little bit of background about why we're here. But first, I'll introduce our guests that are joining me for this first conversation, where we're going to talk about the history of curating or choosing or vetting congregational song. And that is Deborah Carlton Loftus is the former executive director of the Hymn Society. She was my boss when I started with the Hymn Society, and so she was very formative for me personally, just helping to shape how I work, what I do, and how I function in this world of hymnology. And so I'm always grateful for her for that. She's now retired from being a professor of church music, and is living the dream in Richmond, Virginia. Is that right, Deb?
That's absolutely it.
So one of her specialties, just a little tidbit in case she shows up on a Jeopardy category or something in the future. Her dissertation was specifically on shape note singing. And so if you are like a shape note person or you want to learn more about it, Deb will talk to you all day about that. My other guest is Dr. C. Michael Hahn. And Michael Hahn was instrumental in shaping who I am and what I do in these parts, because I studied with him at Perkins School of Theology, where he was the director of the Masters in Sacred Music program. And you're still doing some stuff for them, even though you're emeritus now. Is that correct?
Yeah, adjunctively with the Doctor of Pastoral Music program.
So he still shows up and does some teaching for that, but you are also retired and living the dream in Richmond, Virginia.
Yep.
And Brian, we should say that we have quite a series of connections here because Michael was my professor.
That's right. I always forget.
I thought you had disowned me.
So,
I'm honored that you mentioned that, Deb.
so if anything happens today that is questionable, really it all falls back on Michael. So let me give you all, everyone that's out there, a little background on what we're doing here. I am part of a wider project. My computer is going nuts, so I'm gonna. Hopefully that'll be better. My computer was deciding to just reject a lot of inputs here. So, anywho, I'm part of a wider project on behalf of the Center for Congregational Song, that is looking at vetting the CCLI Top 100 from the last few years. The United Methodist did this project way back in 2015 and has continued to do that. And so I was fascinated by that project, and it was well received by many folks within the United Methodist circles who used the CCLI Top 100 because they wanted some guidance on what from that repertoire actually is Wesleyan or fits in well in our tradition. So we've encouraged a lot of other traditions to do similar projects. And we just presented on it at the Calvin Symposium last week, and are going to be writing up some papers and presenting on it over the year, or over the next year, because a reformed group has done it. They've vetted the CCLI Top 100 and said these songs are the ones that really should resonate and fit well within our tradition and our theological understandings. And the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, did a project. I'm missing someone. Let's see. Oh, the Lutherans. The Lutherans did it. It was a pan-Lutheran group through the ALCM. And so we're going to be putting all those together and kind of distilling those down to a list of CCLI Top 100 songs over the last 5 or 6 years that resonate across traditions and seem to fit well in a lot of different denominational pieties, structures, theologies, whatever you want to call it. And so I wanted to take a step back before we really start, like, announcing those lists of songs from the CCLI Top 100 list. I want to take a step back to really start thinking through why a project like that is, or is not, I think it is important. What has been the history of choosing or vetting congregational song? I grew up singing from the 1990 Presbyterian hymnal, and I sang from that hymnal my whole upbringing. And so that hymnal and the songs that were put into that hymnal were the ones that my pastor and church musicians felt obligated or were happy to choose songs from that collection. So how was that collection put together? Because the process of putting together that hymnal shaped me. And it shaped my faith and my understanding of who God is and who God's people are and what we're supposed to be doing in this life. And everyone has their own stories about the songs that shaped them. And so this is an important process. But the 1990 Presbyterian hymnal didn't always exist. So I thought we'd go all the way back. And this is why Michael and Deb are with me today. I'm curious to learn more and to talk a little bit about, like, what did this process look like? And we're going to start around Reformation time. We're not going to go all the way back. I don't know what hymnal Jesus used, but actually the Psalms, I guess. But but we're going to start around Reformation times. And I'm curious about, who, first of all, if I were a pastor or someone, in a local congregation during the times of the Reformation, who would have been choosing songs for the congregation to sing? I'm a church musician. Was it the church musician? Was it a bishop that told everyone to do everything, or was it the local pastor? Who decided these things?
Take it away, Deb.
Well, I think that it was primarily the pastor, the clergy were the ones making the decisions. And the whole Reformation time was there was a focus on what worship should be like in breaking away from the Roman Catholic tradition. Of course, Luther followed closely on the mass structure, but put it in the vernacular, added hymnody. And Luther himself wrote some of the earliest texts that Lutherans sang. And just looking through notes, they had a small hymnal as early as 1524. So fairly early in the process, the hymns were being collected together. And let me look at my note here so I can get it right. 20 years later, 100 years later, by 1644, you have Johann Kruger's collection, Praxis Pietatis Melica, which was sort of the collection for the German tradition. The Pietists had been writing by then, but that seems to have been from the comments that I looked back over trying to answer your question. A really influential book for Lutherans for a good while. And then the people who were writing the texts were largely pastors.
So I mean,
So they're determining.
Were they writing for their local congregation, I assume?
I think so. I mean, there's the great story of Martin Rinkert writing "Now Thank We All Our God" during the 30 Years' War,
Mm.
in the midst of his own desperate grief and the decimation of his congregation. So yeah, I think they were writing out of their own experience as applied to their ministry. And probably because it was so much rooted in their own experience, it's why it captured the attention of others and became really the core of the texts for worship. And then the prominent musicians of the day were the ones writing the tunes and collecting them, giving people a way to sing them. And of course, Luther was fine with singing in parts and having organ and other instruments and all that. So I think an easy transition in terms of singing practice with the Lutherans, with the German pietistic traditions and Lutherans. I'm going to let Michael handle the Calvinist.
Well, I agree with what Deb said. When I was looking at this specific time and then looking at the whole scheme of what I was struck by how localized initially things were. And gradually, as we move throughout the 18th and 19th century, there become larger and larger groups affected. Keeping in mind that we think of Protestants being widespread, but they were pretty minority in the 16th century. And so the Bohemian Brethren developed their own little thing, the Lutherans, the Calvinists. So there were exchanges. By the time we get to the British, they were borrowing and translating. Miles Coverdale was translating some of the Calvin Psalms into English, but they finally had to do their own thing with Sternhold and Hopkins and that kind of thing that happened later. The Scottish Psalter was its own source, but I think it was fairly localized. The other thing that I could not lay my hands on the article, but probably 4 decades ago or something, I read an article about the Calvinist experience in this country and the Psalter and the role of the precentor, which was almost a semi-clerical role, not necessarily trained in the same way, but held in high esteem. And this person could not even had to have permission to practice these songs, their tunes that they were going to teach. And you just couldn't give that to anyone to do. My guess is that precentor in some traditions, maybe in the Reformed tradition, had some pretty good say about what would be also selected. Of course, with the Lutherans and with the Anglicans, you had the Christian year and other kinds of things more oriented. The Calvinists had less of that. So I think there is a possibility that in some of the traditions, a dialogue at least between the presiding minister and this precentor kind of person. The other thing is that collections were generally words only, because you didn't even get that in the States until interline text until the mid 19th century. So and they were also, people owned them themselves. They were not the property of the congregation, and they were for devotional use back and forth. And so that meant that the individual probably had a lot more control over how they were accessing this material and choosing it for devotional worship. And I don't realize that you're thinking of congregational worship primarily, but I think that dichotomy may not work in this era to kind of keep those separate, even through the 18th century with Watts and Wesley and that kind of thing. I think that exchange back and forth, and that's something I think that we've lost in this. So each.
That's curious actually, because I'm familiar with this phenomenon in the context of Roman Catholic song, in that group singing was being done, lots of Marian hymnody was being done well before Vatican II. There's this tradition of singing at home for devotional practices, and a lot of the congregational song we get in early Roman Catholic literature kind of comes from that. So I'm fascinated to hear that Protestants were also had this home singing tradition, and that fused into, or at least informed, the congregation song. I'm I'm thinking a modern day equivalent of that, a case could be made, maybe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But a modern day equivalent of that would be everyone singing along to songs on the radio.
Yeah,
And
or MP3 files or whatever, and playing them in their car almost as a devotional kind of experience, or around the house or whatever.
so
Yeah,
then I get Joe Schmo coming to me and saying, "Why don't we sing this song?" And I'm thinking, "Where's that song?" Oh, it's that song that they hear on the radio, and they've sung it 10 times this week, and that's why they want to sing it on Sunday morning.
That it sort of seems to me a parallel with the entertainment aspect that we've often kind of pushed away from the more contemporary music, the driven by recordings and concerts, tours, and things like that. But even in England, when they were still singing psalmody, of course, influenced by Calvin's directive to sing in unison, no instruments, all of that. The part songs, there were a number of collections of English psalmody that were set to music in four parts or set as choir books so that people stood on either side of a table and could read the four parts. But it was entertainment at home after dinner. I think there's some examples of knives that have a part inscribed on the handle of the knife, so you can pick up your knife and sing the bass part of the tune. And people, I think Calvin was not able to squelch our desire to enjoy harmony, and that was deemed appropriate at home and dinner parties or evening entertainment. So I think there are a number of threads that carry through like that.
Ludimel settings of the Psalter, for example,
Yeah.
wouldn't have been liturgical, but would. And again, I think it's really, think of how closed in our way of thinking, the separation. I mean, the whole life was a church in the home. And so they were one, and you were kind of developing a bubble, we might say, and so anything you could do to reinforce that bubble. And if you were being persecuted, that bubble was even more important. You mentioned the Marian hymns. Also, they're evidently in Germany, where the Lutherans were becoming so strong. There was a little collection or two for singing during the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, because why should the Lutherans have all the fun? Now, I don't know exactly how all that developed and the extent of those collections. And again, it may have been very localized because of the particular pressures and this kind of thing that were going on, the cultural situation. I think another factor in the localization was much more aware of the peculiarities of individual languages and how music would be, So what is there, 110 meters in the Calvin Psalter? Well, not in the not in the Psalters of Sternhold and Hopkins and all that. Of course, the English but it didn't work in the others. The German, when you look at a German tune, it's not like Truro. We don't know, that's the name of some city or whatever, but it's the name of the first line of the hymn, because that was the tune that went with that hymn, and that's the way you do it in German. And so when we get to our century, a lot of this has become sort of mixed up and homogenized, you might say, in a much different way. So I think that my guess is, just listen to Deb and the context in this early era and even throughout was very localized, and that pastors were taking into consideration not only their own theological construct out of which they were operating, but what would work with this group of people culturally.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I think
I
the
imagine
influence,
there was a lot more repetition too.
I think the influence of the pastor is pretty strong. Sternhold and Hopkins used a lot in England, but the Pilgrims, the separatists who fled to Amsterdam, they came under the influence of Ainsworth, and Ainsworth developed a psalter, again, trying to be more literal and to translate the Hebrew more exactly and not take liberties with it. So that theological concern played out into the kind of psalms that were sung by that group. And then, the Puritans come over to the colonies and they develop the Bay Psalm book because they don't like Sternhold and Hopkins either. And they think they can do better. So I think there are theological concerns at this juncture among this group of English worshiping people that deeply rooted theological concerns that influence what they sing.
And why should the Scottish sing an English psalter? British English psalter.
What I'm hearing is that, I mean, from Reformation times upwards into the 18th and 19th centuries, I mean, hyper localized. You would have collections that are very specific to your tradition, or even your congregation. Your pastor would have the book, or maybe some folks would have books at home, but there weren't like congregational hymnals in the pews. There wasn't a musician who was charged with choosing the songs necessarily. It was really, it's like the pastor has this collection and they're choosing from this. Lots of repetition because most people aren't going to be literate back then, or at least a large portion of people, right? So you got to do a lot of rote memorization, things like that.
A lot of lining out of the Psalms. So the precentor sings, the people respond with the same line, which leads to another set of problems a generation or so later. But
so let's move forward now into the 18th and 19th centuries. We move into a time where publishing is easier. More people are literate. Did that change the availability of song, or how songs were being curated into collections and chosen? We've already referenced a few examples during this time period, but let's focus in now on that time. You start getting revivals and what's
even before that, you got a lot of what I would call semi-political collections coming out of the American independence, and the Watts, various forms of Watts, Winchell's Watts, and all sorts of Watts, and it is fascinating to read through those. One of I looked at more in detail. I think it was Bairstow or something like that, and it was any place you could stick it to the British, you would do that quite explicitly. And then doing away with monarchical language that would be part of the King James as much as possible, things of that nature. And so there were tons of those kind of ones that were used. And I don't know if how widely disseminated and popular some of those were. Some of them were more popular than others, but I would guess that some of them were almost just done for very localized situations. And I think that precentor tradition, again, I'm suspecting that the pastor's saying, okay, I've got a precentor with certain skills. That may have been a factor, and having to prepare the person, how much repetition would we need, how much, all sorts of things that would take into play. I think you can never take away the pastoral elements in these kind of things and the quality and the training. Keep in mind that pastors, though, especially now in the continent, music was a part of their education, like in Germany and things like that, much more so than it is now in seminaries. Part of the gymnasium. there was a lot more focus on music. I don't mean that they were all soloists or anything, but they were not quite like we think sometimes of pastors today. So Deb, what do you think?
Well, yeah, there was in New England, there was a group of ministerial folks in Harvard, and they were concerned about congregational singing, that it had gotten pretty weird in this lining out tradition, and the tunes weren't recognizable. And so they thought that people should be taught to sing, that this was part of worship education, was teaching people how to read the music, follow it, and sing the tune correctly. And that led to singing schools in northeastern urban centers. It led to people like William Billings and, his compatriots of the Yankee tunesmiths, all in an effort to teach people to read music so that they could sing it better in worship. And there's a commercial aspect to that too, because these singing masters were trying to sell their collections, gathering this music from all sorts of sources and publishing a book, and you sell the book. And so there's...
That sounds different. That sounds like a significant change from, I'm going to publish my collection because my town needs it, as opposed to, I'm going to publish my collection and now I'm going to try to farm it out to as many towns as possible.
And I'm going to do workshops.
But there was still that back in England when we were still in psalmody. There were all the part song collections that were published, a series of them, and really famous ones, and ones that have given us some lovely music. They were commercial efforts aimed at people using them at home. So, but they were all about selling these after they were publishing them. So there's a thread of that runs through pretty far back, maybe actualized in different ways in different generations. But the singing schools, I think, and they go for a long time. We're in the mid 18th century, and in New England, the singing school gets transformed by the Second Great Awakening and moves more to rural and frontier areas, down through the valleys of the Appalachians Mountains and such, down into the deep South. And the tunes move from well-known composers and such to folk songs, things that are kind of floating in the air after camp meeting songs, camp meeting gatherings, which are a lot of spontaneous and improvised singing styles. And they take some of Watts and Wesley and other well-known English poets, but the tunes are different. There's a different style, a different energy in the shape note collections. And the singing schools have a social function for the whole community, as well as the educational function. So there are a lot of layers in this sort of dynamic tradition as it moves through the South. And at that point, the singing masters are determining what's being sung, because it's what they put in their collection and what they teach in the singing schools. Some songs get really popular and they get carried from one book to another book because the singing school masters know a good tune when they hear one. So yeah, so there's a lot of blend and carryover, transference from one book to another book.
I think once again the blend between we would tend to say the secular and the sacred was much more mixed And so, what were these singing school things that take place in a church, even though it wasn't a church service? They would have dinner on the grounds. They would have whatever. And while Stamps Baxter may not have been that many people's actual hymnal on Sunday morning, it certainly had an influence. And many denominations, well into the 20th century, Methodists and Baptists, for example, had certain more popular collections that were not often the Cokesbury hymnal and the Broadman hymnal, for example, that were more of your popular hymnal, but it wasn't the Sunday morning in the pew hymnal. Sunday school classes would have it, or you would have it and use it on various social occasions and things of that nature. Going back a little bit, as we entered in the 19th century, and mixing in with the Second Great Awakening, especially, the African American experience starts to take hold with Richard Allen, and his American Episcopal AMEC Church had its first hymnal in 1801, and of course that would have been a very important cultural event in terms of solidifying. A lot of the hymns were his own, and a lot of even there's examples of spirituals that borrowed from phrases from those hymnals that were transformed in other kinds of ways. And I would imagine that those were very important books that would be both domestic and we're still in the enslaved period. An important collection that was not an official hymnal but made a big difference was Slave Songs in the United States in 1867, which is the earliest collection of folk hymnody. It comes from the African American experience, but folk hymnody in the country, and that was collected, off the coast of South Carolina and the islands. Actually, the Union had captured some of those islands, St. Simon's or whatever, in 1861. And so during the whole Civil War, there was a Union presence on these islands in South Carolina, which I find to be wonderfully ironic. And that's where a lot of these songs come from. And we might call them a combination of anthropologists and social workers and whatever now that came down. There were especially 4 people that came down and listened and collected songs among the other tasks they were doing. Because you had enslaved people who all of a sudden, all of the masters were gone. They were on their own. And how do you develop to another life? I mean, everything from medical care, and all sorts of birthing and also food production, all these things. And so that collection was very important, but I don't know that it was anyone's hymnal. By the end of this century, the National Baptists are really quite strong. The National Baptist USA, which is one of the black conventions, and then Church of Christ Holiness with Charles Price. Those two came in, and then you get individual ones like Charles Tinley, who was so in the urban environment in the North. He had his little Soul Echoes book in 1909, but perhaps the most significant of these was Gospel Pearls in this early 20th century. Again, it came out of the Baptist context, but had a tremendous influence. And I think those kind of books floated around between the church and the home and civic engagements and whatever, and just spread. And by the middle of the 20th century, you get the need for just black publishers, period, like Kenneth Morris in Chicago, and there were others in Los Angeles and maybe out east, that because they couldn't get their music out in the Jim Crow area.
So I mean that strikes me once again as a significant difference if we in the 1600s, 1700s, if we fast forward 200 years where we're in the late 1800s to early 1900s, I'm hearing you now reference a lot of crossing, where a curated collection here becomes very popular across traditions or informs new collections, and there's more intermingling of all these songs and collections, and there's just more of them. Whereas before it was like, if you had your local collection, you probably didn't have access or hadn't seen a lot of the other local collections because things didn't travel as fast. There weren't mechanisms to, print 1,000 and ship them everywhere. But gradually, as the mechanisms for printing became better, markets became larger, denominations and traditions got kind of melded and molded in different phenomenons like wars and new countries being formed. And all of a sudden, these songs start getting sent places faster and in different ways. That's what I'm hearing.
And there are denominational influences now by the mid 19th century. I know reading and listening to my good friend Paul Richardson, there are collections of hymns being put together for Baptists by largely Baptist pastors. They're not denominationally approved, or they were not commissioned by the denomination, but they're there. I know there are Presbyterian hymnals being published, and certainly there is some crossover influence from one group to another. Wesleyan hymnody continues to be really popular, particularly in the revival tradition. In the mid 19th century, there were lots of Wesley texts that get picked up out on the camp meeting trail, even if they're only fragments of Wesleyan texts. I remember a Baptist song that I sang growing up, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing, blessed be the name of the Lord. The glories of my God and King, blessed be the name of the Lord." Classic structure of a camp meeting song. And if you look at the Wesley text, it's like every other line of a stanza. It's not even the whole thing. But I think the texts of Watts and Wesley are kind of in the air in people's memory banks and get developed and picked up in these traditions. The urban revivals, late 19th century, I think influenced the way we do congregational singing. And Michael and I were talking about this prior to our getting online today, about the tradition of about 30 minutes of singing to start these big evangelistic meetings. Moody and Sankey, Billy Sunday and Homer Rodeheaver, all the way up to Billy Graham and Cliff Barrows. You can carry that tradition straight through with a really strong musician who uses all kinds of means to build community. I think I'm going to frame it in that, not to say just entertaining the crowd, but to make people feel comfortable and at home and relaxed and ready to listen to the word being preached. So lots of singing of all different kinds of music. Homer Rodeheaver was an artist at that. And the songs were largely in a popular music style, musically a lot like the secular songs that were being sung. And then as people learned them, and maybe as they were converted and found their faith through these kinds of meetings, they wanted to continue singing those songs. And that push from the congregation influenced, I think, Sunday morning worship as well. And I think at that point, we see a stronger influence of the song leader making the musical selections and leading the congregation on Sunday morning more than we have in the past.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So kind of out of these revival camp meeting song schools, all of that going on, where the pastor wasn't choosing things anymore because it was more of the social gathering. The song leader began to establish themselves as an important entity in choosing the song, but it took a while before that really kind of made its way into the Sunday morning worship service way of doing things. Up into to what I'm hearing, like right at the turn of the 20th century, is where you really start seeing. Is that about the right time?
Even earlier,
I
but
would think, yeah, 1880s, 1890s, maybe
Mm-hmm.
it starts to move that way, but certainly on into the 20th century.
but I think also then if that worked for a revival, let's just follow that pattern on Sunday morning or Sunday
Mhm.
evening,
Mhm.
especially Sunday evening.
Yeah.
And but keep in mind also that there were a lot more pastors back then who would jump in with their own song, Black and White, and that would do it on the spur of the moment, or something of that nature. But the one caveat with the more mainline tradition with with Bach and traditions that are a highly liturgical year, I don't know that the pastor was involved every single Sunday because the year was so dictated. It was pretty obvious you had a section you were choosing from.
Mhm.
And I would imagine that certain musicians had quite a bit of play, but they were working within a much more, I don't want to say narrow field, but a prescribed field.
Yeah, they were certainly guided by tradition as well as the structure of the service. And
Yeah,
Yeah, I see in the comments, Dwayne Best says that Episcopalians had denominational hymnal back in the 1780s.
yeah.
So yeah, the more liturgical or tightly controlled liturgical traditions would have put out these official collections or highly recommended selections more
Right.
so than some of the
And
other.
I would have imagined, see, they weren't in the UK, they weren't even singing hymns much until hymns ancient and modern. And so the musician had a lot more control over those aspects of it. So the idea of a pastor saying, "Oh, I got my sermon. Now what's going to work with this?" And I'll tell the musician, I don't think was again a thing until later.
yeah, I think in a lot of cases, the pastor is writing the hymn that follows the sermon.
Yeah.
So, and
And
that's the way we get a lot of the hymns we sing is that they came as the hymn to follow the sermon. And even that held true all the way up. Reminded of Shirley Murray talking about how she started writing hymnody in the 1980s. And her husband John was a pastor of a fairly liberal church, a Presbyterian church in New Zealand, and they were singing out of the 1936 British hymnal. And he said, "There's nothing to sing, you know." And so Shirley said, well, I'll have a go at writing something to follow your sermon. And that's really how she got.
and I'm so glad she did. I don't know how many times I've said her name over the last 7 or 8 years working for the center, but man, I try to shout her out as much as possible.
Yeah. We sang one of her texts yesterday in church, and I was remembering all the wonderful comments she would make about her own hymnody, and about the joy that she found in giving the church such a gift. Anyway,
Let's. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Collections. You're talking about curating collections, and um, there were really, I think, well intentioned and people like Homer Rodeheaver who really worked hard at cultivating African American spirituals, and so much as even sending certain musicians to Atlanta to collect these songs and then notating them. And of course, he made money out of it.
yeah, he was a publisher.
He was a publisher, but he unlike some of the other people of his era who would take these and copyright them supposedly, he didn't do that kind of thing. And so that there's such a wonderful cross-pollination that starts to take place, and those show up. Now, it's really interesting. In the Black experience, they may have a slightly different set of stanzas to go with the spiritual. And the Whites experience, it's more revival-oriented, personal salvation kind of thing. But the same song, takes place. And also the idea of hymnals being a real source of these like temperance hymnals for a special occasion. And I can imagine that on a Sunday night, you might decide there was someone in the crowd that needed to hear a temperance hymn, especially, in the evangelical. But as I look toward the turn of the 20th century, this is probably an oversimplification, so I know someone will, but I decided to keep it simple. You sort of had the Louis Benson side and the E.C. Lorenz side. Louis Benson, kind of the American version of following hymns, ancient and modern, in the U.S. Again, that isn't oversimple, but not too much. He was pretty. It's reading his companion to the hymnal, Presbyterian hymnal, I think about the end of the 19th century. Let's just say he has a lot of personal comments and jabs for certain kinds of literature. And then the Lorenz Corporation, out of which this comes with E.C. Lorenz, it didn't ignore that tradition totally, but it broadened it considerably. But Benson would not have been for that. And so I think in the Lorenz side of things, which would tend to be the evangelical free church tradition, I'm pretty sure the musicians had a lot more play. And I think this would be both in the Black and the White church. For example, I'm thinking of Lucy Eddy Campbell in the Baptist tradition in the mid-20s, 1920s and stuff. People didn't tell Lucy Eddy Campbell what to sing. I'll take care of that, sir. And I think there were certain musicians. Now, obviously, a pastor could say, well, I don't think the crowd's ready to hear my sermon yet. So that means the musician probably didn't do the job like they should have. But so I think there's, and then you get a lot of more official polities shaped in the 20th century and into the 21st about the Episcopal Church and the PCUSA and others, who was responsible for this ultimately. Now, they may choose to handle it differently individually on their local parishes, but it becomes more of doctrine almost.
Yeah, that's what I was about to comment on is as we move into the 20th century, and then most certainly by the time we get to, the mid 20th century where we're gonna or sorry, mid 21st, what 1950s. I'm messing up my centuries. By the time we get to the 1950s, so between like 1890 to 1950, we've really seen this idea of denominational books.
Yes.
Here, if you're a Presbyterian of this kind, you're going to use this book, and if you're Episcopalian, here's your book. And if we see a lot more of that, to the point where then we're not going to deal with the hymnal explosion because that's the next conversation, which I'll tell everyone about in just a minute. But that really seems to have taken hold. And then at the same time, like you were just saying, Michael, then we also start seeing a lot of musicians who are well trained and in staff positions in local parishes, starting to really get hands-on with musical choices on a week-to-week basis. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and then I think as the Presbyterian Book of Order, United Methodist Book, whatever it's called, of keeps you in line. Those kind of things, those kind of collections start to really dictate the role of the pastor involved in worship. And so it's implied sometimes, if it's even not stated, that they're going to be control of hymnody. But on a local basis, some pastors say, well, I don't know anything about that. And then you get other pastors that say, these are my favorite ones, so everyone must like them or know them. So there's all sorts of variants, even in spite of the mandates that are in the various books of order. But I think the evangelicals, people were really traditioned to kind of know how to listen to the crowd, to know their group, to know this how to fit into the sermon. Of course, the purpose of sermons were in the evangelical context were to move toward the altar call. And the salvation of souls was much more important. Well, that changes the whole thing versus the Christian year or other kinds of observances. I think just to peek into the 1950s ahead, then I think the parachurch groups start to develop their own, not just the collections, but personalities.
Mhm.
And then we get the broadcasting taking over in addition to print. And then that becomes a force unto itself. And it takes a pretty strong pastor to have much voice in that kind of.
Yeah. You start to have so many traditions coming into play from the 1870s. You have the gospel song or gospel hymn collections like Sankey's 6 volumes of gospel songs, but you also have the Sunday school movement.
Yeah.
And the Sunday school song.
Yeah.
William Bradbury, William Doane, all those folks who are publishing small collections at first for kids, but then the adults decide they like this stuff and push for it to be in worship. I think as we move through the first half of the 20th century, at least in the free church tradition, I see the influence moving from the pastor making all the decisions to a lot of push from the congregation. We want to sing these songs. We know these songs. We've learned them in another place. And we want these in worship. And whether that's the Youth for Christ or the Sunday school movement earlier or Billy Graham revival, things there, or the radio. We haven't even talked about in the early days of radio. Gospel quartets were so important, and they were on the air and people heard them. So they collected little books and they put them in the back of the car and they went around to various singing conventions and they sold their collections. And that influence, surely through the South, a huge impact. So, but people are hearing this music and learning it, singing it, and they're taking it to their local congregation, which I think is something different than what happened in previous 100 years or so.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I also think this could be really informative for the next couple of conversations, because if you think about the radio, the early days of the radio or the early days of TV, everyone's listening to very similar things because there aren't that many options. You know, you'd have your 4 broadcast channels, or if you're watching TV, you'd have your 2 news stations that you choose from, which is a very different than now, when I have 1,000 channels I could choose from, and I have the internet with the Spotify can give me anything, or whatever. So creating this core repertoire, I mean, that mechanism is so powerful in creating this core repertoire. Like, everyone's hearing this gospel quartet who's popular, and then everyone's going out and being like, well, why don't we do this at church? And it kind of streamlines that pressure that you're talking about, that's coming from the people all of a sudden. It never, I mean, that it would have been impossible to really do that. There weren't mechanisms for widespread unification of or dispersion of repertoire before that. That's huge.
That was the case in the black and the white church. One thing a little sidebar that I need to know more about is in the Spanish language, the Methodists and the Baptists, because of their work in Mexico, seem to have developed some of the earlier language collections. And there were certain people crossing the border and this kind of thing. And of course, so I don't think there were there were some evangelical books later that were kind of freestanding ones. But in the early times, it was primarily those denominational ones. And then as again, printing, and oftentimes they were words only collections. Sometimes they were interlined if they were denominational. But then it's become extremely specialized now in the last half of the 20th century. So there are parallel movements all along. And the recordings also as LPs and 45s and all those things took place, very popular. They could name you which song was on one side and which song was on the other side, you know. You're too young for that, but I remember we used to get those 45s and
Hey, my dad had LPs. I used to listen to them, and I had to change sides for cassettes too. So,
oh well, we want to talk about that.
well, we're coming up on the hour mark, and we've done it. We've gotten from the Reformation to the mid 20th century, which is very impressive. And both in the breadth of knowledge you have, but also the expeditiousness in which we went through that much history. Now, the next conversation is going to be four or maybe five. I can't remember off the top of my head. Editors of hymnals. That come from, you know, what we were just talking about, all of these kind of denominational hymnals that are starting to take hold and at the turn of the century. When you get to post-Vatican II up to the 90s and 2000s, there are some very well established and broadly used denominational hymnals. And so I'm going to talk to some of the people who edited those collections and ask them, what was that process like? How were those decisions made? And then how do you think people were actually using these collections? How do you think it was a guide? Do you think people often went outside of your book to find things, or were people feeling quite restricted to the book? So that should be a fun conversation. That'll be live streamed just like this on March 10th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll have two more conversations after that. I'll announce each one as we go. But Deb and Michael, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge of all of this history. And thank you for all that you've done to shape me and my ministry and all that you've taught me along the way. So anything you want to say to the people before we leave?
Well, it's a pleasure, but I'd say I'm looking forward to seeing what our friends and colleagues will say to fill in the gaps that we left out. That's all right.
Yeah, we kind of skimmed over some stuff.
It was a flyby, but that's what this was for. So you know, if you're watching this and you think, oh, they said something about this person, I want to learn more, you can reach out to me. I can put you in touch with someone who knows a lot more than me about whatever topic you were interested in from this conversation. I might even put you in touch with Deb or Michael if they let me. But there's also some great resources like henry.org where you can search these names, and a lot of them will have bios and information. The Canterbury Dictionary of Hymnology is a wonderful online mechanism for research and learning. If you're a Hymn Society member, you get access to that as a part of your membership. So reach out, do your own research to look into some of these really interesting people and phenomenons, and we'll just keep learning together as we go. So
Thank you.
Grateful for you, Brian.
All right.